Good morning. Welcome to my neighborhood. It's been a while. The world seems to be kind of topsy-turvy. People are getting third booster shots. I understand in Israel, your vaccine passport's required to have a third booster shot, and yet many parts of the world have none. At the same time, we have COP26 happening in Glasgow, and I understand there's thousands of oil industry people kicking around there. The young activists are very upset with this and have just filed a request for UN system-wide acknowledgement that there's a climate crisis, because it doesn't look like COP26 is actually going to get us anywhere. I was thinking about the background of many of the people that are making these decisions, and it's tough to understand complex systems. Complex systems being something a little different than when we take a problem and we take its bell curve of influential bits and we cut off those long bits that go off the edges. We say, okay, this is what we're going to study, and that's the model that we test things in. Complex systems tend to leave those intact. So environment is a complex system, and people that study those things have mechanisms for doing that, but it's not well understood. And if people don't have backgrounds in modeling and mathematics, they may not have a good grasp that actually we don't have till 2030, and we don't have till 2050. And if you take into account things like melting of the permafrost and the 4-degree increases above the Arctic Circle, and the methane that comes out of there. Now, methane's interesting because it does raise climate temperature, but it comes out of the atmosphere faster than carbon dioxide. Still important, though, because it's an accelerant. It accelerates the cycle, even if it is relatively shorter. So, what happens when you have all these people that don't actually understand, that don't really grok that it's in the next 2 or 3 years that we might be able to make the major changes required so that we don't all cook or flood or get blown away. I mean, in Vancouver, we've had our third, what they call weather bomb, in a month, where we get extreme lows, like 44 on the pressure scale, sudden drops, even have a tornado with a small water spout that touched down. I don't think we've ever had one here. Big cyclone off Vancouver Island that stayed there for a long time, a week or so. Massive amounts of rain. It's one thing to have 22 millimeters of rain in an hour. It's another thing to have it for 3 or 4 hours at a go, or more. So, just simple things, but a lot's going on, a lot's in motion. And people aren't really getting that climate change is likely part of what caused this pandemic in the first place, due to habitat change and everything else. That one's a little harder to nail down. But these things are connected, complex systems. And we're getting better at working things out, particularly medically. We've been putting a lot of work into protein folding. And Google has just spun off a company in the UK to use the tools that have been developed mostly by DeepMind, which is mostly owned by Google, using artificial intelligence to do medical research. And it's moving fast. I'd like to see, instead of protests, people standing for something. How do we turn this around so that people can stand up for something? How do we stand up for something as opposed to protest it? What does that even mean? I've been watching virtually the protests in Glasgow and around the world. And even though there's hundreds and thousands of people coming out to protest climate change, somehow there's something missing. I'm not quite sure what it is. Partly, it's that, we're getting older politicians and monarchs and stuff, well, royals anyways, coming out and saying, we should be on a war footing. And typically, treating everything as something that we should fight isn't really a good idea. I mean, we're fighting the virus, we're fighting this, we're fighting that, we're doing a war on drugs, a war on drunk driving. But generally, people fatigue from fear. And people are very fatigued from fear over the last 21 months. It also feels a bit odd to have large gatherings of people when we have rapidly rising case counts in Germany and Iceland and a variety of other places around the world. Again, I can't help but wonder. Just, this business of pushing against. What we are really looking for is something that we can sustain. And perhaps we need to find the things we can stand up for. Are we standing up for sustainable energy? Are we standing up for being part of the environment that we're in, acknowledging that we're part of this ecosystem, that we are not some beast that is removed and above and simply it's put here for us to plunder? How do we, in everyday life, without making gatherings and events of it, stand up for things in a way that is visible and notable? How do we do it individually? How do we do it ongoing? In some things, people wear rubber bracelets or colored shirts or, I don't know, pin a chunk of leather on their tunic. But that doesn't really seem to do it either. I was watching FameLabs today, their semi-finals, where young academic scientists, architects, get 3 minutes to present. And they get judged on context, clarity, and charisma. Presentation matters. And it was lovely. Lots of different things, lots of different topics from all over the world. Excellent stuff. And the audience gets to vote. Well, not entirely. The person that wins the audience vote goes on to the finals, whether the judges put them there or not. So that's an advantage. It's worthwhile voting. You vote for the top 3 and you rank them. So a breath of fresh air in standing up for what you're doing. What you're doing right now. You know how you're going to contribute a small thing that changes the world. Sometimes not so small things. Can you communicate it with somebody else? Does it matter? Why does it matter? Because a lot of people are communicating from their point of view in a positive manner why they should keep mining coal in BC, for instance. You know, the report says we should stop coal, and they come up with a press release and say, oh, well, you know, we've got 57 years of coal in our mine here, and our coal is used for making steel, not burning for electricity, so it should be fine. And we're going to need even more steel to build our infrastructure, and if we flood coastal cities, we're going to need even more of it. And steel is important for making, or coal is important for coking steel. And what you're doing is you're absorbing oxygen with this stuff. So, turns out there's another way to do this. For instance, you can use hydrogen. And the intermediate technique that is implemented in some places is you crack natural gas, and you crack the hydrogen, methane, hydrogen and one other component from the gas, and use that as the oxidizer instead of coke. But it turns out you can just use hydrogen, which would take fossil fuels out of the mix entirely. But that's just one instance. We've got our provincial government in British Columbia going, we're going to put these massive subsidies into export of natural gas and drilling, and we've got all this natural gas, and we'll send it off to China and other places that are burning coal, and they will have less carbon outputs burning natural gas than coal. And so, you know, the global thing will be a net benefit. Again, they're standing up for this as a positive. But when you take into account the costs of drilling, the costs of compression of pipelines, movement, compression and cooling on ships, the transport from one continent to another, and then the reformation and use, the cycle costs in carbon dioxide are just about as high as burning coal. So this is kind of a wash. Sounded good, but it's kind of not. And yet the government is heavily subsidizing this, and if they think we're going to drop 80%, they're not going to drop it all in this sector that they're subsidizing heavily. So in order to make their 80% cuts that they're suggesting by whatever date, the rest of the economy is going to have to cut far more than 80% to account for this. And of course, this isn't the only issue. You know, we have forestry in BC where we're cutting down a lot of trees, cutting down the biggest trees we can find. And, you know, they say they're going to have a moratorium on cutting the oldest trees, or some of the oldest trees. But, you know, they've delayed putting that into place. In the meantime, a lot of those trees are coming down. But more importantly, there is research that talks about the mycelium transport and the nature of mycelium beds in the soil and how the carbon is sequestered not in the trees entirely, but in the soil. When you do a clear cut, you not only disturb the soil and the mycelium beds, but you heat them because you've just opened the ground directly to the sun. And I don't know what happens to the mycelium beds at that point, but they were codependent with the trees, some of them. And so, I don't know, do they regenerate? How long does it take to regenerate? And planting some trees isn't going to help because we're talking 2 to 3 years here for our front loading. The longer we leave taking fairly drastic action, the exponentially tougher and more expensive the problem becomes. And this is one of the problems of having short-sighted governments that are only elected for 4 years at a time. We need a 100-year plan, which I understand China does. Maybe Japan too, I don't know. We are seeing the obvious alternatives, but in this mismatch of information, science there's a lot of papers being published in a lot of areas right now. Amazing stuff happening in materials science and in artificial intelligence and astronomy and all sorts of things. But massive number of papers being published around viruses and molecular biology and pharmaceuticals and proteins and all those kind of things. How do you keep up? Well, there's mechanisms for doing that too. But how do we take these things and roll them into a positive statement? There's a research paper that just came out, and it updated an old piece of research that said, hey, the old one said that false news, misinformation travels faster on Twitter than real information. Well, they revisited the study recently, and they looked at the dispersion trees, I think is what they called them. How a tweet about something fans out over a large space of individuals and bots and things like that. And what they found is that looking at the dispersion trees, you could not tell whether something was true or not. The characteristics were not different. So what we have is a lot of information moving around, but it isn't weighted, as people have been led to believe in the past, on false information. The valid information goes out just as far and just as fast using the same mechanisms. We see quite a bit of blanket blaming of social media, amplifying effects and all this kind of stuff. But this study counters that a bit. And, while governments and public health officers are beating on social media, they're also using it. And strangely, most of the people watching briefings in which they're beating it are watching it on social media. So you can't really have it both ways. There's good mechanisms in here. They're not perfect by any means. There's a lot of impetus to make them better. Whether that will happen or not, we don't know. It'll certainly change. So back to the original thing. How in the world, instead of declaring war on things, instead of once in a while creating protests that feel a little weird, gathering a lot of people together in confined spaces when we still have a pandemic going, how do we, on a day-to-day basis, stand up for something? What are we going to stand up for? The lobbyists are very good at making a case why we should keep doing the things they want us to do. Produce natural gas, produce oil. There was a fellow interviewed the other day who said, it's going to take us 10 years to transition the sawmills away from the old growth, so, we have to keep harvesting it for the next 10 years. But planting trees takes hundreds of years for them to grow, and that does not take into account reinstatement of mycelium beds, which may be critical to the sequestration that they do. Can't grow them in 2 or 3 years at all. And the old thing they teach in forestry, that it's the youngest trees that sequester the most carbon, not when you take it into account in terms of a complex system, it's not. You have to look at the context, you have to look at the overall spread of the stuff. So, thank you for coming on a walk with me today. I see you. I appreciate that you're there. Thank you for listening. And I hope, how do we stand up for things? How does somebody know that you're standing up for something? Certainly, there's a certain amount of that happening on social media. But how does somebody know that you're standing up for something? Now, part of Extinction Rebellion, for instance, is about taking a risk. Part of Ferry Creek blockade is about taking a risk. It's about standing up for something and in front of something often. So that risk historically for civil disobedience has been measured in arrests. Are you willing to be arrested to stand up for something? But does it have to be? This kind of creates another war footing again. How do we take things? Somebody asked me the other day, we need something that each and every individual can actually do that will mitigate some part of this problem. So I went out and looked. And there was a company, I don't know if they're still around, that was producing something that looked like a large bath bomb, the soda and Epsom salts and all that sort of stuff in it. But this one was different. It was mycelium. And it was designed to go in your lawn. So in much the same way that the trees absorb carbon and put it into the soil, it allowed you to dissolve it in a big bucket of water and spread it around over your lawn or your garden and increase the mycelium activity such that more carbon would be sequestered in your soil. Just one simple thing you could stand up for and do. I mean, more people are riding bicycles. More people are riding electric bikes. They're much cheaper than an electric car, and all the people that have them tell me they get on their bicycle more often, because here we have some pretty steep hills. And it takes a certain amount of psychological wherewithal to get up to the top of the hill before you can go anywhere that's even semi-flat. So the electric bikes help in that regard. People are not using them just as motorcycles, they're pedaling. So that's another thing. I mean, and it's visible. You're riding a bike. So what other things can you do? How can you be present in the world? How can you be present in the world where you're standing up for sustainable environment. Thank you. I'll see you next time. Hopefully it won't be so long. Bye now.